Hello, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Father Andrew and I'm the acting chaplain at the Beauchamp community at Newland, just on the edge of Malvern in Worcestershire. At the moment, like many people, we're missing our common church activities, and although you're able to tune in to our website and watch on YouTube videos of our masses, so far you've escaped sermons, and it seems that only too appropriate that we should be spending a little bit of time in Advent thinking about this important season. So I'll spare you a sermon, but this is perhaps a slightly more informal chat about some of the things that we might be thinking about at this time of year. It's traditional actually in Advent to think about what are called the four last things: death, judgment, heaven and hell. And that's perhaps why partly Advent is seen as a rather serious season. You may feel this year that we've done more than enough thinking about death. And I think it's certainly true that in a year that has involved this pandemic, we've all been made to think about our lives in a different and perhaps slightly more stark way. In doing so, we've been aware of the fragility of life, and we've been aware that our own lives have had to change in quite dramatic ways. We've had a sense perhaps of time moving differently. And perhaps that has led in many cases to a type of existential angst, some questioning about what life is really for. What are we doing with this precious gift of life, and where does it lead to? I think those are very natural questions to be asking, very natural anxieties in many cases. But as we come to the end of a calendar year and begin a new church year, it's perhaps worth reflecting on these things afresh and considering what it is about death that makes it a suitable topic for discussion. I remember many years ago now reading Tom Stoppard's plays, read a whole lot of them, and I think it might have been in his play Jumpers, where we have a philosopher asking a very pertinent question. He says something like this. He says, why is it that we don't remember that first moment when we were children, when we realised that we were mortal? There must have been that moment. There must have been a time when someone told us, or we came to realise, that we don't go on forever. And this philosopher asked the question, why was it not more stunning? Why do we not remember that and its impact? Surely it's an incredible thing to learn that we don't go on forever. And I suppose one answer to that question is that we seem to have some inbuilt understanding of our mortality. I think St. Thomas Aquinas, the great Christian philosopher, would suggest that that's one of many of the little hints that God has given us of the way his world is, an inner realisation and understanding that that is how our life works out. And it's something which other philosophers have explored over the centuries. I used to teach René Descartes' Meditations, and in one of the more difficult passages he's talking about his arguments for God's existence. And he actually suggests that one of the reasons we can believe in God is that we understand things which are not really accessible to our human reason and our human nature. After all, we are mortal, we're very limited, and yet our concept of God is of a being who is immortal and unlimited and eternal. How can our puny, mortal, limited minds ever grasp those ideas? And Descartes' answer is that really it's a gift from God. He gives us a little understanding of himself when we face those questions. That our own mortality perhaps helps us to understand the wonder of God's immortality. And if that doesn't quite work for you, it's a bit philosophical, we could take a more perhaps mundane approach, and that's an approach which I found fun enough in the writings of Richard Dawkins, who's no great friend, of course, of religious views and understandings and interpretations of life. But he, I think, made the point somewhere in his writing that we become attuned to death because change is something which we experience day to day. And when we come to reflect on it, we see that the changes we experience are in a sense little deaths, and we are used to those. We can think of examples in our own lives. The conversation we had over a pint of beer in a pub some months ago that we can't replicate now. The walk with a friend on the hills or in the woods, perhaps some deep conversation. Again, we can't quite relive that experience. Visiting a place that we may never visit again. In each of those cases, we can, in a sense, mourn the loss of what has been. And that mourning is, of course, much more stark when it involves the actual death of a loved one, someone to whom we can no longer turn with a smile or reach out to and touch. But that experience in life of having an experience, having something very precious and losing it, is a reminder that our life always goes forward. We understand it more as we look back, but it's lived forwards, and we have only an elusive grasp on the things that we enjoy day by day. They don't last, or at least if they last, they, like us, change day by day. And that change is something that often makes us fearful. I think that's very understandable, but something which also enriches our life because we realise how precious the moment is. And so often our Christian calling really is to let go of the self and simply be and simply enjoy being in God's world, simply reaching out and accepting the gift of life as it's presented to us. The more we try to grasp it and make it something we want to own, the more elusive it is. And Advent, in a sense, is a time of looking both forwards and backwards and appreciating something of that tension with our lives. The good things are wonderful moments along the journey, which we can cherish in retrospect, but we can't actually own and hold on to them permanently. So in Advent, we do look back as well as looking forwards. We're looking forwards, of course, to Christmas at the conclusion of the season, and perhaps this year, with fewer distractions in our limited lockdown and tiered environments, perhaps we'll have a chance in a way to experience Advent in its own right before rushing straight off to Christmas. But the season is also a chance to journey back in time and try and experience along with the Jewish people their growing expectation and understanding of the coming of God's Messiah, the one whom we know as Jesus Christ. It's always hard to enter fully into that because we sort of know what happens at the end. We had a bit of a spoiler. We know about Christmas before we start Advent, but that's okay. We can still have some empathy, I think, with the journey that those people make as they consider how God may unfold his message to them and his presence to them in our world. We light traditionally 4 Advent candles as we approach Christmas, and on the first Sunday of Advent, when we light our candle, we remember particularly the patriarchs of the Old Testament era. We remember Abraham, Isaac and Jacob in particular. And each of their stories has an element of that idea I was referring to a moment ago about moving forwards and not being able to hold on to what has gone behind. So for Abraham, it was recognising and responding to God's call to leave his homeland, Ur, a Chaldean town, and to go to a place called Haran, and then in fact to move on to what would become known as the Promised Land. It involved bereavement, of course, leaving his homeland, leaving his loved ones, leaving all that was familiar. For his son Isaac, perhaps the most noteworthy challenge that we remember is the near sacrifice, when Abraham had to confront this idea that he'd moved from a culture where child sacrifice was a holy and valuable thing to a culture where God no longer expected such a blood sacrifice of our human children. In that remarkable and very disturbing story, really, when Abraham sets off apparently to obey God's call to sacrifice his son, we learn that both he and Isaac discover, to their delight I'm sure, that God doesn't demand the death of Isaac. It's a test of faith. I wonder what sort of test it was for Isaac in terms of his relationship with his father as well. But in that experience, they learn that life changes, often dramatically and abruptly, We can't wish and hope to get back to where we were before. Experiences mould us and change us, and hopefully for the better. And the third of those patriarchs, Jacob, well, he doesn't get an altogether good write-up in the scriptures. The scriptures are very honest, actually, about him. He's a rather dodgy character, something of a trickster. And of course, he is the victim of a trick himself when he goes to work with Laban for 7 years to get the daughter he wants, only to find he's tricked and married off to the wrong daughter. So he works another 7 years. I wonder how he felt about the sort of death to self of working in that way, to look forward to a future when he'd be blessed with the love that he wanted. So death isn't really just about that conclusion to our lives, that ending of our mortal selves. It's a death to the self, yes, day by day, a death to our preoccupation with controlling our lives, perhaps controlling our relationships with others. But I think it leads to a type of freedom, and it's wrapped up with this whole idea that we have of faith, an understanding that in God's hands the future, scary and unpredictable as it may be, is something that we can trust. And we're invited, therefore, at the beginning of Advent to step forward boldly, no doubt with some trepidation, as we always do, but boldly in faith, understanding that God will lead us to where he wants us to be. We will look back at times. We look back on things that we've valued and enjoyed and no longer have. But they will remind us that God's gifts are continuous, that throughout our journey he blesses us in different ways. And I hope that that will give us some courage and some encouragement as we make our Advent pilgrimage towards the birth of Christ at Christmas. We're heading towards a wonderful thing, a great gift of God, but the journey itself has to be made. I mentioned Abraham, who left all that was familiar to make that journey to the promised land. And of course, wrapped up in the whole story of the incarnation is the faith of Mary, who says yes to God's call to be the mother of his Son. And we too are called really to allow Christ to be born in our own lives. And like pregnancy, that's not something that can happen in an instance. It takes growth and gradual maturing. And Advent gives us an opportunity to experience that growth and maturing again each year. It's a wonderful time, a time of great blessing, and I earnestly pray it will be a time of blessing for you and your loved ones as we go through this time of preparation, when in the darkness of autumn we look forward to the light of Christ.